It is our commitment to fair play which is the foundation of our notion of community. We admire individualism and individuality, but we're not exclusively individualists. And emphatically, we in Britain believe there is such a thing as society with all the rights and responsibilities that go with membership of a community of people. And these are the values that make me proud to be British. And I believe that a forward-looking and modern patriotism, right for the 21st century, can be built on them. I think and believe that a true modern patriotism is to promote the acceptance abroad of the values we hold dear today, and crucially, to make the patriotic case for international engagement in the alliances of which we're a part and not isolation. We must work outwards, in other words, from that domestic doctrine of community to a doctrine of international community that is based in the end on our enlightened self-interest. And you know, we in Britain still have enormous diplomatic assets in the world to bring to play. Again, all the legacies of a proud history. With our seat on the UN Security Council, our role in the G7, our closeness to the US, our membership of the European Union, our position in the Commonwealth, our trade links with Asia, the credibility of our armed forces, the power of the English language, we still have huge diplomatic strengths. But to seize the opportunities of our history, Britain has to regain an inner self-confidence about who we are and what kind of country we want to be. We have to define, in other words, what our patriotism means for today. In doing so, of course, we never jettison our history. We could not succeed even if we tried. But ours is a nation that has ancient European roots, stamped through and through by the legacy of a history that goes back to St. Augustine's mission to Kent 1400 years ago, perhaps even to the landing of Caesar's legion 600 years before that. London was a great European city in Roman times. Edinburgh was a jewel of European civilization in the Middle Ages. Ramblers in the Peak District tramped what were once Roman roads. We're all products of that history, whether we like it or not. And we played, as a country, an active part throughout our history in keeping the balance of power in Europe, forming alliances to secure our own interests, and above all else, in defeating the greatest evil of the 20th century, Nazism. So, with all that history, I find it strange and wrong that for large parts of today's Conservative Party, Europe, they say, is the source of all our problems. Indeed, Margaret Thatcher made that clear again this week. For us, by contrast, Europe is a unique opportunity for influence and leadership in the world, giving that leadership on questions that are in fact vital to our own national interests. And that true patriotism is standing up for the British national interest first. And in the 21st century, that patriotism demands that in a world moving ever closer together, we do not turn our back on Europe, the key strategic alliance right on our doorstep, on which millions of British jobs depend and 60% of our trade depends. Such isolationism is not standing up for Britain. It is relegating Britain to the sidelines of a Europe in which our jobs, our industry, and our influence are intimately engaged. Now, we will recommend joining the single currency if it is in our national economic interest, and it is you, the British people, who will have the decision in your hands in a referendum. But the issue for this election, remember, is Europe. Because the Conservatives have now confirmed that they plan 2 summits straight after an election to renegotiate existing European treaties which Britain has signed. And I warn this country, that is a policy playing with fire. It is a step away from leaving Europe, and that would be a disaster for Britain, British jobs, British industry, and influence in the world. On trade, we are listened to in the WTO, because we act as part of Europe, and because we're seen as a key influence for more open trade in Europe. In the Middle East, for example, we have influence because we act together with our partners. And that's what I mean by Europe becoming a superpower but not a superstate. We remain nation states, but by working together, we increase our leverage on the global problems that face us. And that's why, if you look around the world today, similar groupings of nations are springing up elsewhere in the world. Another point I want to make very strongly to you is that the choice that is sometimes posited by the conservators, that we have to choose between the US and Europe, is again, I believe, a fundamentally false one. We are stronger in Washington if we are seen to be leading in Europe. And we have more influence in Europe if we are seen to be listened to in Washington. Stronger in Europe is stronger with the US and vice versa. And Britain's role, surely, is to be a bridge between Europe and America because of our traditions with both. I am proud of what we've achieved in our first term on Europe. We've moved from marginalization 4 years ago to a new influence. We successfully defended our rebate in Berlin without being isolated, at the same time as securing the biggest ever share of structural funds. We put forward proposals on European defense, which complement and support NATO, which have now been agreed by our partners in Europe and welcomed by the United States. We can make a strong claim, indeed, to have the best armed forces in the world. They're widely respected overseas, and for me, our armed forces are a source of intense patriotic pride. When I took the decision to authorize the hostage rescue in Sierra Leone some time ago, it was a decision, and frankly, only a British Prime Minister, because of the professionalism of our troops, would feel confident in taking. In Kosovo, again, our armed forces were outstanding. In truth, however, today, they will work mostly alongside the troops of other nations. In the Strategic Defense Review of 1998, we chose to build on the key strengths of our forces to ensure that they're well-trained and equipped, flexible and mobile, and sustainable at long distances from their home base. But we recognize, too, that were we to face a major crisis, we would do so in the company of firm allies. That is why NATO remains vital to our defense as a living alliance of partners with shared democratic commitments and values. But it is also why it is vital to improve EU defense capabilities on the vital condition that this strengthens, not weakens NATO. You know, contrary, again, to what some of the skeptics say, the Americans have always wanted the Europeans to do more to pull their weight in the sphere of defense. With European defense, we in Europe will at long last be able to punch our weight and shoulder our responsibilities where discharging them should fall more on us than America. That is one example of British leadership in Europe over the past 4 years. But let me take another example. Over the past 2 years, we've led the process of economic reform in Europe, moving Europe away from concentration on regulation, winning arguments against harmonizing taxes, and pushing forward reforms of labor, capital, and product markets. But this is only possible if we engage in Europe properly. Over these past few years, therefore, you remember when you used to go to every summit, or the British Prime Minister would, and all the talk was of isolation and how we were isolated in this way and that way. It's no longer happening. Because in Europe, we've shown it is possible both to hold our ground on issues of fundamental national interest and to exercise real positive influence to achieve our aims. Now, that is what we've done in the first term. But in a second term, if elected, we will continue to take a leading role in setting the agenda in Europe. We'll take forward the case for further structural reform to make European economies more flexible, more dynamic. We will take a leading role in enlarging Europe and in getting the first wave of applicants in by the 2004 European parliamentary elections. And we will work with Germany and our other partners to get radical reform of the common agricultural policy. It is a fact that we face common challenges across Europe. Take an issue like the abuse of our asylum system. There is a real problem in the number of unfounded asylum claims from people coming to Britain. Some people think this is a uniquely British problem. The truth is, it is a challenge facing all European countries, and indeed many countries outside Europe. The number of applicants per head means Britain comes somewhere in the middle of the European league table, contrary often to popular perception. Today's asylum figures show that the measures that we put in place are having an effect. Last month, asylum applications were down 15% on the same month last year, and the backlog is at a 10-year low. But we know there is still much more to do. And again, this is an area where to tackle it requires a mixture of our own measures in our country and European action. And that is why, as well as employing thousands more immigration officers and introducing fines for hauliers caught smuggling in illegal immigrants, we've taken the lead in developing a coordinated European approach. These are all areas where we need to set the agenda as a country for the future. And we will also take a leading role in the debate on the future structure of Europe. We want to give a new democratic legitimacy to Europe by ensuring that national governments are the ones that set the agenda through the European Council. We want a clear agreement about what should be done by Europe and what should be done by nation states at the Intergovernmental Conference in 2004. On the single currency, as I said earlier, we set out our position in 1997 and it has not changed. In principle, we support a successful single currency. In practice, the 5 economic tests have to be met. We make an assessment of those tests early in the next Parliament, and if they are met, the issue will be put to the Cabinet, to Parliament, as I said earlier, to the people in a referendum. In Britain, a country with pride in our democratic heritage, it is right that any decision on the euro ultimately rests with the British people. And I want, if I might, just for a moment, to return to a point I made earlier and contrast that position on Europe with that of the Conservatives. I said earlier it was a step away from exit from the European Union. And let me explain what I mean by that. Because this policy of the Conservatives has not had yet the scrutiny that it deserves. According to the Conservative manifesto, they would refuse to ratify the Treaty of Nice unless all extensions of QMV were removed from it. Mr. Hague says he would insist on this at the 14th of June summit in Sweden, just after the election. Not one other government supports that position, and he would need all other 14 governments to support the position in order to secure it. So what would then happen? Mr. Hague would be faced with two choices. The first choice would be a humiliating climb down in the face of a united front from the other member states, or the Conservatives would have to start the process of negotiating Britain's exit from the European Union. If the other 14 would not accept their refusal to go along with that treaty, bringing enlargement to Europe, that would be a Conservative government's only alternative to humiliating retreat. And the truth is, as Lady Thatcher made it clear this week, a large part of the Conservative Party do want to get out of Europe. That Conservative Party manifesto also proposes to renegotiate Britain's essential terms of European Union membership, the so-called pick and choose for European legislation. Again, not one other European Union nation agrees to it. Again, humiliation, because we'd have to retreat from that position, because all 14 would have to agree, or exit would be the consequence for Britain. I simply say to you that nonsense such as this would put at risk British jobs, British investment, British business, and British livelihoods. The Conservative European policy poses a grave threat to our economy, and far from standing up for Britain, today's Conservative Party would give up Britain's interests to their own divisions. That is not patriotism, it is folly. I will fight for Britain, and I will fight for the British economy. I will fight for Britain's interests in Europe, but I will fight for Britain because it is right that Britain gets the best out of our membership of the European Union rather than retreating back to the marginalisation we left 4 years ago. Great thing about these speeches in the election campaign is everywhere you go, they're kind enough, not just to provide you with a rostrum, but with a sauna at the same time. And I think you guys have been taking pictures of that, haven't you? Well, you've got enough of them already in the campaign, actually. Now, that choice between backward-looking isolationism and forward-looking patriotism, I don't think is confined to Europe. But I want to raise, amongst many of the other issues, I want to raise two other policy priorities for a second term, if we are elected to it. And it may seem, and some people have said to me, it is rather strange to raise these as two critical issues in an election campaign, but I want to explain why I think they're important. I was actually first attracted into politics by issues to do with the developing world. And at the start of the 21st century, it is a scandal that 1.2 billion people, that's 1 in 5 of the world's population, live in extreme poverty. 150 million children are underweight, at severe risk to their mental and physical development. TB kills more than 2 million people each year. Malaria, more than 1 million. More than 36 million people worldwide are affected with HIV, 95% of whom live in developing countries. 113 million children of primary school age have never been to school. And 1 in 4 adults, that's almost 1 billion people, are unable to read or write. I think these figures should shock every one of us. I think they are an affront to our common humanity, and I don't believe we have any right to call our world civilized while so many people in nations around the world live in these conditions. And poverty on this scale, is a source of global insecurity too. In a world that is ever more interconnected and interdependent, none of us can remain isolated from the consequences of deprivation elsewhere. So many of the problems which affect us today, war and conflict, international crime, the trade in illicit drugs, HIV/AIDS, environmental degradation, are caused or exacerbated by world poverty. I am very proud that in the last 4 years, under Claire Short's leadership, we've refocused the whole of Britain's international development effort on the reduction of extreme poverty and the achievement of the international development targets. These targets include halving the proportion of the world's population living in extreme poverty by 2015, universal primary education, a reduction in infant and child mortality by 2/3, and sustainable development plans in every country to reverse the loss of environmental resources. For years, under the previous government, development aid was cut as a proportion of national wealth. Between 1997 and 2003-04, this budget will now rise by 45% in real terms, totaling £3.6 billion in the final year, which is the largest UK aid budget ever. And we are spending these resources in new ways. We see aid as an investment to help countries put in place economic and political reforms, promote higher levels of growth and better public services, crack down on corruption, promote human rights, including for women and girls, and develop effective governance and democracy. We have completely untied UK aid so that countries can purchase goods and services from the most cost-effective source. Tied aid reduces the value of the aid budget by as much as 25%. Britain is the first major developed donor to have untied aid, and we're pushing for other countries to follow our lead. But I don't think the development effort has had more important impact in any area than the area of international debt relief. Like millions of people up and down this country, I believe it is wrong that poor countries should be forced to divert precious resources from key development priorities, such as health and education, to the repayment of high and unsustainable levels of foreign debt. And it was this Labour government which argued for a fundamental review of the heavily indebted poor countries initiative to provide faster, wider and deeper debt relief, and for debt relief to be linked to strategies for poverty reduction. It was us that wrote off all remaining aid debts owed to the UK. It is us that are committed to complete debt write-off on export credit debts for those highly indebted countries that come through that process. That is 100% debt relief for these countries. And UK pressure, and let me say, the tremendous campaign to which I would like to pay tribute, led by Jubilee 2000, the churches, faiths, and development NGOs, has also brought real results internationally. At the end of last year, 22 heavily indebted poor countries had qualified for this relief. Reliefs totaling more than $50 billion will be provided to these countries, reducing their debts by 2/3 on average. This will release, in turn, more than $1 billion a year, and as a result, countries spending on anti-poverty programs, health, education, and safe water will be more than 3 times what they pay in debt servicing. Over the last 4 years, too, we've also hugely strengthened our support for education and health in developing countries. We've allocated an extra £500 million to education, with over 80% of those resources spent on primary education. We've made a major contribution to the international effort to combat the diseases of poverty, such as HIV/AIDS, TB, and malaria, allocating over £1 billion to support basic healthcare systems focused on the needs of the poor. And we have supported the development of an AIDS vaccine for Africa, where there is a different strain of the virus. Our work now is to create what we call a global health fund focused on these diseases, a fund to help make existing drugs and commodities more accessible to those poor countries. We are confident that such a fund can be established at the forthcoming UN conference on HIV/AIDS, and earlier this week, Claire announced that the UK government will commit £75 million, helping to provide drugs and health commodities to those who so desperately need them in the developing world. So this is what we're trying to do for the poorest countries of the world. And on all of this, debt relief, disease, education, nowhere is the need for action greater than in Africa. If elected for a second term, I will make Africa a major personal priority and a priority for the Labour government. 40% of Africa's population lives on less than $1 a day. Half the countries in Africa have been affected by violent conflict in the last 5 years. The HIV/AIDS epidemic threatens to reduce life expectancy by up to 20 years. The scale of this challenge is enormous, and we shouldn't be naive about the difficulties. But I say to you, the costs of carrying on with an Africa riven by conflict and disease, where life expectancy is falling, is not something the civilized world can contemplate. It isn't right. If we had the will and were prepared to commit the resources, we could do something about it, and we should. We know that progress, indeed, we know that progress is possible. The abuses of human rights that were endemic a decade ago are being swept aside in some of the countries by new leaders and new democracies. And some African countries have made real economic progress. Uganda and Mozambique have both achieved economic growth rates of over 6% a year in the last 5 years. And the fastest growing country in the world, indeed, in the 1990s was not in Europe or in Asia, but in Africa. Botswana, reaping the benefits of decades of good government and sound economic management. More than that, I think today, a new generation of reformist leaders is emerging in Africa. Potential political reformers. Yes, they're fighting against the odds, but I think we can and should form a partnership with these leaders, a real partnership for Africa's development. And the partnership consists of this, that if they are ready to push through the difficult economic and political reforms that are needed, to stamp out corruption, promote honest and effective government, then we, the developed world, must be ready to look again at our own policies on aid, trade, debt, investment, and conflict prevention to see what more we can do and what other major European and other economic powers can do to help. We need a new partnership between Africa and the West, not as donors and recipients, but as equals, as partners in a common endeavor. Africa cannot develop on its own, and we can't do it for them. But together, we do stand a chance of giving them a new start. And if we win on the 7th of June, I will be taking these ideas forward with Thabo Mbeki of South Africa, who will be visiting Britain the week after the election, and then at the G8 summit in July and at the Commonwealth summit in October. So that is one area of foreign policy which we should concentrate upon. And the second is the need for international engagement in the battle to safeguard the global environment. The Kyoto process was a tribute to enlightened global diplomacy. It represents the first real step down the road of collective action to meet a collective challenge to the future of our planet. But it is only a first step. Even if all the developed countries met their Kyoto targets, we would only reduce global greenhouse gas emissions by 5.2% of their 1990 levels by 2008 to 2012. According to the best climate change models, if we want to halt the process of global warming, we need to cut global CO2 emissions by 60% or more. Now, the current impasse shows just how difficult this will be. The European Union and the United States are key to finding a way through. And because of our role in the European Union, our links to the US, we have a special responsibility to try and find that way through. But I simply say to you again, the more I have looked at the evidence over the past 4 years as Prime Minister, the more I am convinced that the future of this planet depends on this battle against environmental degradation being won. And I think it is our duty as a government, both on our own, in Europe, in every international sphere, to play our part in bringing about the measures necessary to reverse that environmental degradation and to save the future of our planet. So in all the battle over the big issues in the election, strength of the economy and the investment in public services, the measures of fairness, support for the pensioners, I think the choices of this election also revolve around our position in the world too. And the choice in the election is very clear, a choice between isolation or engagement. And I believe in that forward-looking patriotism that knows that Great Britain can offer a real example in leadership in Europe and in the wider world. And sometimes young people in particular who feel alienated from the political process, disinclined to vote, should think again precisely because of some of the issues we've raised this afternoon. Because politics can make a difference. Just look at the debt campaign. Ordinary people demanding change from governments, governments responding here and internationally, leading to real reductions in debt and bringing benefits to some of the poorest countries in the world. Cynicism and apathy are the enemies of progress. But moral purpose and political commitment, civic society and governments working together can achieve much. We do have that British identity built on the values I've articulated. We do and can have a pivotal role in the world based on our values as a country. Politics does matter because of the choices it offers about the kind of nation we are and ought to be. And in this campaign, that does obviously revolve around the issues that are central to people's lives, I think it is important to raise the profile of this argument about Britain and our place in the world. And I think it's important to do so, not just in respect of Europe, but in respect of these wider issues as well. Over 4 years of being Prime Minister, you learn many lessons. One is that government is definitely better than opposition. I can tell you that for certain. But another is that when you look at some of the problems you're called upon to deal with, for example, the 1998 financial crisis, or the problems of the environment, or how we give the developing world some chance of a decent future, or the problems of nuclear proliferation, all the arguments that concern the debate around missile defense at the moment. In respect of all these problems, the only way we can tackle them is to take that basic principle of community and acting together that we want to apply to policy within our country and apply that same principle to our relations with nations outside our country. These problems can only be solved together. I remember well in the 1998 financial crisis, when myself and President Clinton at the time sat down and worked out what to do. All those people, some of them the most ardent advocates of the free market, they stopped pretty quickly when the crisis started to spread from country to next country and then to have a knock-on effect on the financial markets of the world. And people then wanted us to come together to stop the crisis spreading and to put in place the measures necessary to bring some order to financial markets. And when we look at the weapons of mass destruction in the world, and we see those countries trying to develop nuclear and biological and chemical weapons, there's no way we can deal with these problems isolated, on our own as a country. We have to deal with them in concert with others. And when we look at the issues of trade, that seem very arcane and removed from people's lives, but actually every step in liberalizing trade is a step towards prosperity and the exchange of goods and some chance of a decent life for people producing goods and services in different parts of the world. None of those issues can be tackled by our country retreating into isolation. So that argument about Europe and about the need for us to engage in that key strategic alliance right on our doorstep, the argument about Europe is actually symbolic of a far bigger argument about Britain and its place in the world. And my case for Britain is that we have huge strengths in our history, but we have to use those strengths to build our future, to take each one of the historic alliances, whether in NATO or in the Commonwealth or in Europe or in the G7 or on the position on the Security Council in the United Nations, take those historic positions and then allow us to forge a new set of partnerships that deliver the future for our nation and other nations that we wish. That is why, underneath all these arguments about Europe, is a far bigger philosophical argument about what it means to be a country today, proud of its history, but willing to work with others for the 21st century. And I believe that many of the issues that we confront today can only be tackled by that type of partnership and cooperation. It's one of the reasons why I think and believe that the principle of solidarity is not a redundant value. It's as relevant today as it's ever been. And what I've tried to set out for you this afternoon is how that principle applies, not just to our relations with Europe, but to the wider world. And that choice between engagement, positive engagement, and isolation is a big choice in this election. And I hope on June the 7th, the British people choose for engagement, reject isolation, and allow us to develop the patriotism that we need and deserve in the 21st century. Thank you.